Remember that time that Jesus was thirsty with that woman at the well? He asked her if they could have a drink together. And she was like, I don't think we should be talking to each other. And he was like, if you had any idea who I am, you would be begging me to buy you a drink. And she's like, I don't think your bucket is big enough for my well. You guys are supposed to be laughing. You laughed with David. Why not me? And he's like, you have no idea. And she's getting a little thirsty herself now and accepts his offer. But first he checks, where's your husband? No husband, she says. He questions that, something about multiple husbands. And then they argue a little bit, and eventually this argument resolves, something about worshiping his mountain, and then she runs off to tell her friends all about him. And then the disciples show up with all these questions, and Jesus is like, chill, you just don't get it. Good morning, Watershed. My name is Blair, and I'm the greenhouse pastor here, which is why I had to edit the version of that story that David actually sent me, because it was just a bit spicy, if you know what I mean. Something about the word gushing was in there. I was like, let's not use that one. So I want to this morning talk about the woman at the well. And I think that as funny as that version of that story is, I think that maybe that's how John intended it to be for us. Because I think that he liked to get a rise out of people, and he liked that shock factor. Now, aside from being a children's pastor, I am a tutor at a local elementary school with English language learners. I spend as much time with my friends who inspire me to be my best self. I'm a daughter, a sister, a kick-butt aunt, and hopefully one day a partner and parent. I've never been married and have no kids of my own. Don't let that distract you. I don't know why either. You're trying to figure it out. But I'm actually the only one teaching during this series that is currently experiencing the dating world in all of its glory. And I say that very sarcastically. And I bet some of you are probably thinking, the ones who are married, you're probably like, dating's the easy part. And I hear you. I believe that every type of relationship we have is complex. The friendships, the dating, the relationships, the situationships, co-parenting, exes, on and on and on. And so that's why I feel pretty strongly about talking to you this morning about the messiness of relationships and how they can lead to some serious exhaustion and, unfortunately, eventual cynicism. When I started testing out dating apps a few years ago, I remember asking my more experienced dating friends if certain things were normal, and their response was yes. And you're probably going to have to do those things too if you want to find somebody. And I was like, And by certain things, I mean this whole cat and mouse game, the one that everybody says, guys want to feel the chase. You can't let them know you're interested. Don't text back too quickly. Don't text back too slowly. Meet with within a certain amount of days. Don't meet within a certain amount of days. Don't cross your arms when you're with them. Ask questions, but not anything with depth. Don't meet for a meal on the first date. Do meet for a meal on the first date. Ghost them if you don't want to see them again. Don't ghost them. That's rude. These are the things that I dealt with. True story, the first time I got ghosted 5 years ago, I messaged this guy and thought he was dead. I was like, did you die? He was like, no. Now I feel pretty dumb about that. But I was new, okay? So there are all these invisible rules that I realize people have created out of self-protection and survival mode and probably some selfishness. And I just found them to be disgusting. I wanted to know, why can't we just all show up and be our true selves? I didn't get it. But fast forward through 4 years, a new city, and dating during a pandemic, and I've recently realized that I've become exactly what I didn't want to be. Because I'm exhausted with dating. Exhausted to the point of feeling cynical and cold-hearted and just apathetic, don't care. Self-protection and selfishness, I realized was how I was choosing to show up in that space of my life. And it was exhausting because it wasn't who I am at my core. And so I hated it. Emotionally and relationally, I think this might be how the woman at the well felt just a little bit. Exhausted, frustrated, and not feeling very hopeful about humanity at that point. This conversation between this woman and Jesus that's found in the book of John, it starts with Jesus traveling at noon, and he stops to rest in a place called Jacob's Well, which still exists, in Samaria. And yes, the Bible actually does say noon is whenever they were there, so clearly that time must be important. And it's believed that that time of day is whenever no one else was at the well. So I'm pretty sure she wanted to show up whenever nobody else was there, trying to avoid people. And also, Jesus was a Jew traveling through Samaria in the first century, and that's not typically what happened because they weren't big fans of each other. So this Samaritan woman she walks up to the well, and she's coming to obviously get water from the well, and Jesus asks her to drink with him. And she basically is like, "Are you talking to me? How is it that you, a Jew, want to drink with me, a woman of Samaria?" The fact that this conversation even happens is the shocking part. It's not even about what's in there. It's just that it's even occurring. Because we see two taboos at once here. First is that Jesus is a religious teacher, and he's talking to a woman in public. And that's not typical, because patriarchy. And then it's not just a conversation, but it's the longest conversation that's ever recorded in the Gospels with anyone. Then second taboo is that Jews and Samaritans are interacting with each other in intimate ways, which is the sharing of water. These two groups don't like each other at all. They disagree at their core. They both think they're right, the way that they worship God, and they refuse to see the other way. And so there are two fault lines of division here in this story: gender, and then religious and ethnic sectarianism. And John brought them front and center because Jesus brought them front and center, which he tends to typically do. And Jesus answered her in the story and said, "If you knew who sang this to you, then you would have asked me, and I would have given you living water." So Jesus here is trying to hint that he's kind of a big deal, and she's a little weary. I don't blame her. And so she's not buying it, but she still continues this conversation. And she goes on to say, kind of in a smarty pants kind of way, "Sir, you have no bucket and the well is deep. Where do you get this living water you're talking about? Do you think you're better than Jacob, the one who gave us this well?" And then Jesus responds to her, "Everyone who drinks the water that I give them will never be thirsty again." So she's willing to try what he's talking about at this point, but I still don't think she's buying what he's selling. So she says, "Sir, give me this water so that I may never be thirsty or have to keep coming back here to get water." Now, this conversation, this story, is showing us two principal features of the way Jesus shows up in this world and how we're invited to show up in this world. First is that we live in a way that dismantles divisive hierarchies, patriarchy for one. Second, that we live in a way that bridges these divides. Now, the book of John, overall, is very focused on getting rid of historical rules, the categories that people have created. It wants us to know that God has come to be present with us. It's moving us towards relationship and intimacy. Now, this story, we'll go back to it. It continues with Jesus telling this woman to go tell her husband about this living water. And she tells him she doesn't have a husband. And he's like, oh, I know. You actually have 5. And the one you're with now is not even your husband. And this is where she actually starts to believe that maybe he's someone important, that maybe he is a prophet, because he knows things about her. Today, we'd call that a stalker, or Joe Goldberg. But back then, they called them prophets. But really, this section is so interesting to me because the way that it was taught to me as a kid is very different from what the text really says. So Dr. Jennifer Garcia Bashaw, she's a New Testament scholar, and she wrote the book Scapegoats, the Gospel Through the Eyes of the Victim. And she says this woman in the scene was not a blushing soon-to-be bride, but she was a wedding-weary woman. Now, I'm not sure about you, but like I said, I grew up hearing this passage, and this woman was always painted as a scandalous, unfaithful tramp most of the time. Even a prostitute possibly came up. But the fact is that neither Jesus nor the gospel writer make a statement about her 5 husbands. And it's quite likely that the marital status of the woman is not her fault. Divorce in the first century context would not have been initiated by a female. So it most likely was that she was the one that got divorced. And it could have been from infertility. It could have been any reason that they deemed justifiable. And so her life, if that was the way that it was going, was pretty much plagued with uncertainty and rejection. There's also some scholars who interpret these husbands not in the literal form, but in a symbolic form, where they actually talk about those 5 husbands could be the 5 political powers that had ruled Samaria, the 5 groups that were rumored to have compromised the early Samaritan people, or 5 pagan deities or religions with whom Samaritans had committed idolatry, and prophets most of the time used idolatry and adultery interchangeably. So it's important that we don't come to this text and interpret it through our own modern lens. And that modern lens sometimes has some pretty misogynistic assumptions. So back to this story, she's like, wait, if you're a prophet, then why do you think we have to worship in the temple in Jerusalem? Because we, Samaritans, believe that we go worship God on Mount Gerizim. And Jesus responds by telling her who he is. So he felt safe enough to do that. And that location is no longer important, because his arrival signals something new, a new intimacy with God. It's not about a temple or a mountain, but it's about God's word made flesh. Then the disciples showed up confused, as usual, because of who Jesus was talking to pretty much. And then the woman went back and told everyone she knew about this encounter, and they all believed, it says. And like I told you, friends, this was huge. Jesus is challenging these old systems that are there, saying there's no need for animals anymore. There's no need for money changers. There's no need to compete about sacred sites. These systems are no longer about those things. And it wasn't just those things during that time, but it was also the social barriers between men and women, between Jew and Samaritan, between friends and enemies, insiders and outsiders, us versus thems. So this movement towards a new intimacy, it's a new exodus towards freedom for all. It's struggling together towards a different world. And just like John reminds us throughout the book that intimacy is the key to imagining and creating this different world, I think that that matters for us today. So I want to talk about what the heck is intimacy. I want to call it emotional intimacy and define it as allowing ourselves to connect more deeply with others through actions that express feelings, vulnerabilities, and trust. It involves being able to share your deepest fears, your deepest dreams, your deepest disappointments, and your most complicated emotions. And it's not just about sharing them, but it's about feeling heard and seen and understood when you do share them. I know some of you are probably thinking, oh, that's a perfect world. This feels hippy-dippy, but it's not. It's possible. Esther Perel, who is a Belgian psychotherapist, says that the quality of your relationships is what determines the quality of your life. And the bonds and the connections that we make with other people, that we establish with them, gives us a greater sense of meaning, of happiness, of well-being than any other human experience. Now, I wholeheartedly agree with this statement, and I think she's right about the value and power that relationships hold in our stories. But relationships have shifted so much over the years, especially in marriage. What we used to get met by an entire tribe or village, now we expect that from one person. Things have changed. We're kind of making up a new system as we go, and they need to keep changing. We've unraveled the one we had, then we unraveled another one. The ones that were pretty simple because they were dictated by rules. Religion had very clear structures and incentives and prohibitions for people who were married. All the big decisions were made for us in those relationships. Who was going to be the breadwinner? Who was going to wake up to feed the baby at night? All of these things were already decided. And the social hierarchy was very clear. It told parents how to talk to their kids, how children had to respond to adults, how husbands had to talk to their wives, and how wives didn't have to answer to their husbands. Now, as that changes and evolves, we're stuck in a world full of options and choices and unprecedented freedom. But the sad truth is that we don't live in a relationship-cherishing culture. We all live under the rule of patriarchy. Family therapist Terry Real says in his talk, The Birth of Relational Joy, that patriarchy is a binary. Half of human qualities we call feminine, half of human qualities we call masculine. And everybody knows which side is which. Masculine qualities might be strong, independent, brave. It's never love, never connection, never vulnerability, never yearning. And then the feminine side is nurture, sensitivity, emotionality, dependency. And the flip side of that is the hierarchy that goes with it as well. These qualities are not seen as separate but equal. Masculine qualities are typically seen as more valuable. So patriarchy hurts us all. Why? Because we can't be faithful to the model that we were raised in and be intimate at the same time. The traditional gender roles of men and women are not built for intimacy. They're built for production, consumption, and stability. We're living a linear patriarchal life instead of a deeply relational life. And what is truly a relational life? It's an authentic, loving connection to yourself and to others. Now, there's no question about the complexity of relationships. From the time we were born, our connection to others has shaped us. And the truth is that we tend to hold ourselves the same way that we've been held in previous relationships. We create relationships that we've seen, had, experienced, and those relationships and connections develop a person's attachment style or their specific way that they relate to others in a relationship. This is what affects me in dating. This is what affects your arguments with your partner. This is what influences your parenting style. And the list goes on and on and on. I've put up here, there are 4 different attachment styles. There's secure, anxious, avoidant, and then anxious avoidant. If you're in that last one, there's like 7% of you. So that's a fun group. Our goal is to be in the secure. And I'm not going to talk about this for very long because it's something that you can look up yourselves. But our attachment style, it does affect our relationship, and it changes based on who we're in the relationship with. So we can show up very differently in different relationships. I will tell you right now, most people on dating apps are very avoidant. Just so you know. But if secure attachment is us showing up as the best version of ourselves, then how do we do it? And it's going to take work. It's not easy. But I think that there are 2 ways. The first is that we recognize which part of ourselves is showing up at any given moment. Is it the functional adult part, which is the part that has a developed prefrontal cortex, that can recognize their ego, that is able to practice mindfulness? Or is it the part that is our adaptive child part? Is it the part that we have learned how to just get along? Or, the part that sobs, the part that's wounded inside of us? It is only the functional adult part of us that wants to be intimate. The wounded child in us is overwhelmed and is focused on self-protection and survival. So if you want to be intimate, first you have to come out of your triggered self and get recentered. Who you are will determine if your relationships are successful. Not what you do, but who you are. So who are you? Who am I? This is what I had to go back to when I had this realization about my own heart and soul. And the way I'm trying to figure that out is by using this thing called a bullseye. Maybe some of you have seen it. It's a values clarification exercise that was designed by Swedish therapist Tobias Lundgren. I always think about Tobias from Arrested Development. But it's a dartboard, and it gets divided into 4 important domains of life. There's work and education, leisure, relationships, and then personal growth or health. But it makes you think about what's important to you deep down. It's not goals. It's actually who you are at your core. What sort of qualities do you want to cultivate as a person? How do you want to be in your relationships with others? Our values are our heart's deepest desires for the way that we interact with and relate to the world. They are the leading principles that guide us and motivate us as we move through life. Now, just as Jesus upended the norms in his engagement with the Samaritan woman, I think it's time for us to upend the fake relational norms of today. But rather than treat this as a selfish free-for-all, I think we need to approach it with the same intentionality that Jesus had. We're all connected. We're all living in this ecosystem. We're sharing this space. And I believe that deep down we're mostly good at heart. Selfishness is that adaptive child part. It's our response. It's our way to self-protect and survive. But a different world is possible. Let's be people who love well. Let's be people who wake up to the world around us, struggle together, resist the norms and systems and policies that don't give life to all of creation. I'd like to close with a beautiful poem that I found that I think it clarifies what it looks like to move forward towards intimacy, becoming the soil from which we grow. It's called Let Us Be Women Who Love, but I've changed it to Let Us Be People Who Love. Let us be people who love, Let us be people willing to lay down our sword, words, our sharp looks, our ignorant silence and towering stance, and fill the earth now with extravagant love. Let us be people who make room. Let us be people who open our arms and invite others into an honest, spacious, glorious embrace. Let us be people who carry each other. Let us be people who give from what we have. Let us be people who leap to do the difficult things, the unexpected things, the necessary things. Let us be people who live for peace. Let us be people who breathe hope. Let us be people who create beauty. Let us be people who love. Let us be a people where the divine may dwell. Let us be a garden for tender souls. Let us be a table where others may feast on the goodness of our universe. Let us be people who give life. Let us be people who love. Let us rise to the questions of our time. Let us speak to the injustices of our world. Let us move the mountains of fear and intimidation. Let us shout down the walls that separate and divide. Let us fill the earth with the fragrance of love. Let us be people who love. Let us listen for those who have been silenced. Let us honor those who have been devalued. Let us say enough with abuse, abandonment, diminishing, and hiding. Let us not rest until every person is free and equal. Let us be people who love. Let us be people who take courage and sing the song in our hearts. Let us be people who say yes to the beautiful, unique values seated in our souls. Let us be people who call out the song in another's heart. Let us be people who teach our children to do the same. Let us be people who love. Let us be people who love in spite of fear. Let us be people who love in spite of our stories. Let us be people who love loudly, beautifully, divinely. Let us be people who love.